Katherine McKernan is the CEO of Homelessness New South Wales. Prior to that, she's had a number of very significant positions which are relevant to homelessness. She's been the Associate Director of the Strategic Policy Unit of New South Wales Health. This is a very interesting connection because a great deal of the rhetoric on homelessness attributes the condition of homelessness to mental illness. And in some cases that's a valid attribution, in some cases it's not. But the fact that Katherine has worked in a role such as that and then moved into the peak position within Homelessness New South Wales is a wonderful testimony to the background work that she's been able to perform and bring to that role. She's also been the Principal Policy Officer at the Department of Family and Community Services, where she developed the FACTS NGO strategy and sector planning work in disabilities. She's also been the Director of the Community Services Division of the New South Wales Office of the Ombudsman, or is it the Office of the New South Wales Ombudsman? That's the one. Yeah. And the Ombudsman, as you know, has a very significant role in challenging government action at all levels. She's also been the Principal Policy Officer in Housing New South Wales, where she worked in the Homelessness Unit and was responsible for assisting in the development of the Homelessness Action Plan and other key initiatives.
I'm Katherine McKernan. I'm the Chief Executive of Homelessness New South Wales. Homelessness New South Wales represents specialist homelessness services across New South Wales, so we advocate with the government around homelessness policy and also the service system and so on. Do you want me to speak up? Sure. The last census, 2011 census in New South Wales, there was around 28,000 homeless people. 6,000 of those were rough sleepers. So the rest of the population is actually women and children who've experienced domestic and family violence and young people who can't live at home. Having said that, since the census, and I'm sure you're all aware of it too, you will have noticed that there's been a marked increase in homelessness over the past 12 to 18 months. Over in Belmore Park and Wentworth Park, there's significant homeless populations that haven't been there before. And there's services, domestic and family violence services, that are experiencing a huge demand for their services from women and children escaping domestic violence. And we're also seeing a really significant increase of young people in the rough sleeper population, which is indicating that there's issues for young people who are homeless as well. What we're also seeing too is groups of people who've never really been in the homelessness space before, such as older women. So women who've been raising families and not in the workforce for the majority of their lives, as experiencing a marriage breakdown or some other thing, and finding themselves, at a very late stage of life on the streets or homeless or using homelessness services. And often I think that people, when they see rough sleepers or they see homeless people, they think, well, why don't they just go to a service? Why aren't they accessing the services that we have? And the issue at the moment is that the services themselves are actually full. The data that we have around that really is only around the City of Sydney street count. The City of Sydney does a street count 2 times a year. And in the August street count, there was over 370 people found on the street. But significantly, there was also over 460 people in the crisis system that night. And the crisis services were 90% full. So there was actually nowhere for those over 360 people to be referred to. There's nowhere for them to go. And this isn't just happening while we've got the stats for the City of Sydney area. We know from talking to services that this is actually happening across New South Wales. So in rural areas, in Newcastle and Wollongong, a colleague was in Nowra yesterday, and the showground has got tents and a huge number of people sleeping in the showground. So this is unprecedented in recent times in terms of the number of people who are homeless. So what services are having to do, because they can't actually accommodate people, they're having to look at what innovative ways to provide services, which is things like supporting women and children to sleep in their cars, handing out blankets and swag so that people are warm enough at night, and really just checking up on people. And so that's the situation we're looking at the moment, that services helping people maintain their homelessness in a safe way, really. And you may have seen in the media or heard about the Going Home, Staying Home reforms that were brought in July 2014. Those reforms actually, the principles are really supported by the sector. They were actually about moving from an ongoing and continual provision of crisis support to people to try and prevent homelessness by looking at people who are at risk of eviction and helping them to maintain tenancies, and then looking at providing long-term accommodation with support wrapped around so that people can actually live independently and not have to be in the crisis system for a very long time. And so those are the evidence is there that this is what actually works to address homelessness. But the ironic thing that we've got is at the moment services are actually working more in a crisis situation because there is no housing and there's no way of moving people through the system. So they're providing more crisis services than they have before. So I'm spending a lot of time in meetings discussing various issues around homelessness and working with services around how to provide services. And so we're finding ourselves in the kind of depressing state of knowing the evidence and knowing the research which shows that, for example, for people leaving custody, the best way to keep people leaving jail from becoming homeless is to provide them with long-term accommodation and identify the support needs that they might have in their home. And there's mounds of research, and Common Ground is actually just up the road too. It also provides long-term housing with support wrapped around. It shows that if you work intensively with people in long-term accommodation, they will actually remain housed. They won't become homeless. But we're just not able to work with that system at the moment because of the lack of supply of affordable housing. So, as Mary has mentioned, that's in the social housing space particularly. She talked about the 60,000 plus waiting list and the fact that that's actually a capped waiting list because of the criteria that's placed on people. There's over 60,000 people on the waiting list and people are waiting over 10 years for housing in some cases. So there's no social housing. And as Mary has also mentioned, the private rental market is just really not affordable if you're on a benefit of any kind. Anglicare do an annual rental snapshot, rental affordability snapshop, and these statistics I find staggering, but of 14,000 properties, only 58 were affordable and appropriate for households and income support payments in Sydney. So we're looking at, it's just not an option for people. So homelessness services used to use the private rental market and head leasing private properties as a way of helping house people because of the social housing waiting list in metropolitan Sydney in particular, but also in Newcastle and Wollongong now too. That's just not an option because it's just not affordable for people. So really, and we're working in an environment where there is no Commonwealth policy at all on affordable housing, and no New South Wales policy on affordable housing or anything. There's a social housing policy that's coming out soon, which is great. It's good to see that the Minister Hazzard is focusing on the social housing element, but there's no thinking around how we actually make housing affordable in New South Wales. And so what we're looking at in the short term and probably the long term is a real increase in homelessness because there's just not the affordable housing available that's required. The other issue we've got is that there's no real effort at the moment for agencies and services to actually prevent homelessness from occurring in the first place. Basically, homelessness is an outcome of system failure. So people become homeless. They become homeless because they haven't received supports as young people when they're living in families that have placed them at risk. They've experienced domestic and family violence and they've had to flee in order to be safe. Or they've had mental health or drug and alcohol issues, or they've just lost their job and there's nobody there to help support them through that. So homelessness is actually an indication that the rest of the service system has let people down. And at the moment, we really don't see the health, mental health, the drug and alcohol services required, education, looking at helping young people, and the out-of-home care system really working to make sure that when people leave out-of-home care aged 18 that they don't move into homelessness. And and also people living prison. There's some research that came out from the University of Melbourne fairly recently, and it's found that they looked at over 1,000 Australian homeless people, and they found that 42% of the people released from prison in the past 6 months in the cohort were homeless. So, I mean, you've got a huge risk, and that's due to being in prison, really. So we really need not only the affordable housing, but we also need services and institutions to really look at preventing homelessness in the first place by supporting people to access affordable housing, but also receive services that they need to stop them from becoming homeless. And I think that the thing about this that we all need to think through, in the absence of any commitment from government, is that we've got a 2.5 billion surplus projected for New South Wales in 2015-16, which is a result of stamp duty and the soaring property market that we've got. But at the same time, we've got an increasing amount of homelessness. So we really need to be asking ourselves what kind of society we want to be living in. Do we want one where property prices are just great for if you're rich or if you're inherited money or able to buy, but for the rest of society you're looking at increased homelessness? So that's essentially the way it is at the moment. Yeah.